Okay.
Trying to figure out screen share and then ready to rumble.
Yeah. So I can just share my entire screen basically like this.
Yeah. Yeah, no stress.
Should I just keep it up now?
Yeah, I think so.
All right.
Yeah, I think so.
Cool. So I can't actually see anyone's faces now. Oh no, yeah, here we go. Share my screen.
And then just kick into percent. Cool. Wickeds. Where'd you get this dog from?
Honestly, it was like I don't really know, man. I kind of just like I think it came from like a rebrand from like one of the companies that I worked, or actually like from this agency that we worked with when I was in venture capital, and it kind of just stuck.
Yeah.
Everyone loves a dog with glasses, apparently.
Looks smart, mate. Looks smart.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Cool. I guess we'll wait for everyone to give it a couple of minutes for everyone to join.
Yeah.
Cool.
And so questions will come in, basically.
Yeah, there's bottom right. There's a little Q&A which you can just have open.
Okay, awesome.
And I can mark which ones we've answered as well as we go.
Okay.
Cool. Wicked. Thanks for joining, guys. We're just going to give it 30 seconds more and then we'll kick off as everyone keeps piling in. So you've done the talks like this before, Daniel, haven't you?
Yeah. I've done this specific talk quite a few times at different venture funds and then other founder communities. And then I've done a bunch of others as well, not necessarily on this topic.
Yeah.
But centered a bit more around later stage growth, whereas this is usually kind of like the frameworks and the foundations for that early stage growth, just to like how to think about it systematically in quite an organized manner. Because I think things can get pretty hectic and crazy, especially at that early stage when you have 1,000,001 ideas and probably it's either yourself or maybe a member of the team and yourself as the founder. And so this is just kind of a way to structure that in a relatively OCD way with a bit of like flexibility around how you can, adapt it to your own kind of business and how you think and stuff like that. But
cool.
Yeah, that's kind of like the idea behind it.
Let's get stuck in. I think we've got most people on the call now. So guys, thank you very much for joining. I know everyone's like pretty damn busy all the time. So to carve out a bit of time in the middle of your day, really appreciate you guys joining. Welcome to Founder Nation Masterclass on 4-part process to building your go-to-market strategy. This is a topic that is regularly the biggest pain point for a lot of founders and kind of business operators. Just how do you find those scalable channels? How do you get your product to market? How do you position it? Loads of questions that kind of come under that go-to-market kind of umbrella. I know Daniel, we've been working with Hot Source for how long now? 8 months? Maybe? Bit of time.
Maybe a bit less. A while now at this point.
Yeah. And obviously, well, I'll let you do a quick intro to yourself, actually, Daniel. Why don't you dive into a quick intro to your own background?
Yeah, awesome, cool. Yeah, so as Andy said, we're going to be discussing 4-part process of kind of building a go-to-market strategy. I guess before we get into that, just a bit about myself. So yeah, kind of fell into growth marketing. I studied maths and economics at university, typically thinking that I was going to go down the finance route. In my second year of university, ended up joining a company called Stint, and I was kind of back and forth from uni trying to figure things out. Ended up joining full-time as a second employee post-university. and fell into a role that ended up being a head of growth role. And that company was called Stint, left as they basically were raising a Series C, 150 employees, and then went and joined the dark side, as I typically call it, basically selling money. So joined a fund called Samapata, Southern European-based fund. Basically, my job there was portfolio support in terms of growth, and also fundraising to close their next fund, essentially. Spent a couple of years there and basically said, okay, I can probably do this for myself. Been on the operator side. I've been within venture capital, and basically started the startup CMO, where I provide fractional CMO support and help build out fractional growth teams for early stage tech companies, as well as angel invest into a select few companies. So that's kind of been, I've been working with early stage growth for over 10 years now. And I think this kind of masterclass comes from a real pain point from my perspective during my time at Stint and what I saw at Samapata. And, you know, I feel that if I stepped in at Stint right at the start and had this kind of way about thinking about growth in an organized and systematic manner, I would have been way less sporadic about things. So yeah, it comes from a real deep pain point of mine, and can only hope that it'll help all of you guys as well. In terms of companies that I've helped and worked with, really there's three main buckets. Bucket one is basically late stage fractional CMO support. Bucket two is basically pre-seed, seed, Series A, hands-on support, just through myself, so as a full stack growth marketer. Or if you're VC backed, want to hit the ground running at that early stage, basically help build out fractional growth teams. And that's typically where you either bring in specific freelancers, or you bring in, someone from overseas, like India or South Africa, to kind of help in a cost efficient manner, which I found to work extremely well. And yeah, these are kind of some of the logos that I've worked with over the last couple of years.
Mm-hmm. And I can add to that. I mean, I've been working with you for, I think it's about 8 months. And you really helped bring a lot of kind of organization and a bit of a plan to the chaos that was preceded you, where it was just me kind of like chasing any idea that came to mind. So it's been really, really helpful. So I've personally worked with you, and it's been like pretty transformative for how we've kind of approached our kind of go-to-market strategy. So yeah.
Appreciate that, Andy. So yeah, I mean, basically, these are the 4 different components. I think the biggest two, obviously the bullseye framework and the growth framework, which we'll go into a lot of detail in the later slides. But basically the 4 components that make this up are bullseye, grows, experimentation within that, and then the documentation of learnings. I think before I dive any deeper, I think the last point here around the documentation of learnings, I think, is probably one of the most overlooked elements of that growth journey. I think it's one of those things that people just kind of brush away, and I think it's definitely one of the most important things. When I say documentation of learnings, it's really based upon what are the different experiments that you're running. How do I consolidate that into why, and basically documenting that into a format that you can understand, that other people within your team can understand as you kind of grow. And definitely one of the most overlooked elements of this stack. But yeah. So
just before we dive further in, guys, there's a little Q&A function in the bottom right. So there's kind of 9 dots under meeting tools. If you click that, you will see there's kind of a Q&A section is one of the options. We want to make this as conversational as possible, and we want you to dump your I want you to dump your hardest, dirtiest questions on Daniel. Like, what are you struggling with in your business? When we're going through some of the frameworks, ask those kind of difficult questions, and we'll see what we can get answered on today's call as we go. So yeah, we want to make this as conversational as possible. So yeah, please send those in via that function.
Awesome. So I can't actually see anything that's going on my right-hand side. So Andy will just
Keep an eye on it. Yeah.
we'll keep an eye on it and butt in. But yeah, to add to that as well, we want to make this as conversational as possible. So feel free to ask any questions throughout the time that I'm basically discussing, and just dump them in as I'm talking. And I'll try best to answer them to the best of my capabilities, basically. Yeah, so the first part, as I mentioned, is the bullseye framework. Usually this is, typically where I would ask anyone and get them to raise their hand to see if they've heard of the bullseye framework. Obviously it's impossible doing that now. So I'll just jump to the next slide essentially, but maybe I'll ask Andy if he's heard of the bullseye framework.
Yeah, I have 3. Thank you.
But yeah, this is a framework that was basically developed by the founders of DuckDuckGo. If I had to recommend something, it'd basically be the book called Traction that was put together by Gabriel Weinberg and Justin Mez. And essentially what we see here is 3 different rings. I'm going to go into each of the rings on separate slides. But the idea is that you want to consolidate a plan through basically discussing all of these channels in detail around what could work for your business, essentially. So at the early stage, like when you hear strategy, typically you think about this as, here's our go-to-market strategy for the next, 12 months, 18 months. Here's a one-time document, like let's go off and execute this. Whereas that's okay when you understand what kind of channels are working for you already. But when you're in the experimentation phase, and trying to understand what channels you can use to basically help you scale, you need to be a lot more flexible. And also you need to be able to test, experiment, iterate on the different ideas within these channels. And that's where the bullseye framework comes in. It's basically essentially a tool to really allow you to hone into what channels could potentially work for you, help you prioritize those, and then basically iterate off the back of that. So on the first ring is all the channels that you can basically invest into as a company. Typically there's like 19 to 20. Obviously there's some more that are coming up, like GEO, which can feed into SEO, AEO, and so on and so forth. But really the fundamentals here for your teams is to basically discuss each one of these in detail. Could this work for your business? Have you tried it before? What are the elements or any of the data points that you have on this to really fundamentally understand, could this be a channel that we can invest into? And the idea here and the action point here for you guys is, if it's just you can probably do this on your own. And if it's you and a co-founder, or you or an early hire, the idea here is basically, okay, let's discuss viral marketing. Let's discuss business development. Let's discuss direct outreach, and really fundamentally understand, what to invest your time into, essentially. I think there's a question. Yeah, that's basically the outer ring. And so once you've done that, you basically move into the second ring, which is, okay, you've established what are the channels that you want to invest your time, money, resources into. Now, typically that's anywhere between 1 and 6. You'll basically be in a better position to understand, again, time, resources, etc. The best probably way to think about this is I would probably look at testing anywhere between 3 and 4 initially, and then switching out 5 and 6 for potentially channels that haven't necessarily worked as well, over a 3 to 6 month period, essentially.
Just a quick question on that, Daniel. What are the common things that you see when a channel is successful and a channel is not successful? What are the common traits that you maybe have identified across the business that you work with? Because obviously the ideal target is you pick 6 and all 6 work, and you want to have as close a kind of success rate on those channels that you pick, first time rounds. You don't have to kiss those frogs and waste time on channels that you then have to kind of spin out. So what are those traits that you see that kind of do work and don't?
Yeah, so really, you actually don't need 6 channels to really scale. And actually, like, my view here is that you really want to just find 1 or 2 channel, really just one channel that is actually scalable for you to invest all your time, money, and effort into, and have complementary channels within that. I think the specific traits of those channels is really just dependent on on what kind of business you are, whether you're B2C, B2B, B2B2C. But I think a trait from a team is basically like fully committing to those channels over a specific time frame. For some channels, it takes a bit longer. For other channels, it takes a bit shorter. And what I find is that the best teams will, 1, commit fully, and 2, have a blend between short and long-term channels. So take SEO, for example. SEO isn't necessarily something that's going to breed short-term benefits to your business. However, in the long run, it can be massively beneficial, but it just takes a bit more time. Whereas that direct outreach, we could set this up today or this week, and you could see results next week, basically.
Okay.
And so I guess, like, to answer that question is, 1 is really commit and focus to the channels that you pick. 2, find channels that you feel are both like within that middle ring, which we're discussing now, that are both long-term and short-term channels. Usually at the earlier stages, I would say get a split of probably 3 short-term channels and 1 long-term channel. And as you kind of move from pre-seed, seed to Series A, etc., or if you're a bootstrap business in terms of like growing that revenue, really just depends on what your North Star is here. Is basically slowly but surely move more towards longer term channels and complementing that with shorter term channels.
Cool.
Not sure if that fully answers the question, but
no, I think it does. I think we've got some questions that have come in from a couple of people, but I think let's get to the end of the bullseye framework, and then I'll pose those to you.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So basically, this is what the middle ring is about. Is once you've basically had those non-biased discussions around all the different channels that you can invest into, really now you have anywhere between 1 to 6 channels that you're saying, okay, let's commit to this, and let's basically test these channels. And we're going to get into the next section around like how best to actually discuss now this middle ring to get a fundamental understanding of experimentation on what works and what doesn't. But that'll be the next slides within the next section. But really, the last thing here that I wanted to talk about is the inner ring, or the bullseye, essentially. So once you basically tested different experiments within these channels, you'll basically be able to collect specific data points on these channels to compare and contrast what works, what doesn't, and what you should really focus on in terms of that bullseye. In that bullseye, you need, again, 1 to 3 is what the typical framework says. In my opinion, I think if you only have 1 and you're able to like fully invest and grow into that, that's great. And then you have 2 complementary channels that you basically complement that 1 scalable channel. And from there, you basically have your long-term marketing mix. Sounds very easy on paper. And I've been working with Andy for at least 6 months now, and we're still in that kind of inner middle ring layer, really trying to help and understand what that scalable route to market is in terms of a specific channel. Yeah, so I think we can open up to questions. I think this is obviously a task for you guys to do after, whenever you get these slides. But essentially, here I've put together a Notion template, which covers in detail each of the different channels to potentially for you guys to kind of discuss about with your teams or internally with yourself, and basically, in short, to kind of pick the growth channels that you feel that could work for your business, essentially.
The one thing that I would add, which I think has worked for us doing this exercise with you 6 months ago, Daniel, was trying to pick channels that might reinforce each other. So, for instance, producing content on LinkedIn would reinforce direct outreach through LinkedIn. So doing that organic content piece reinforces really well with kind of doing the direct outreach. Those two work quite well together, and we actually have seen results improve as I've produced better content. The outreach has become more successful. So there often are kind of some overlap and some advantages that kind of reinforce each other, and that if you can find those within the channels that you're selecting, that will give you a better chance of success. Yeah. We've got one question for Sahir, who's kind of, how do you decide if an experiment for a certain channel has been set up correctly? Cold email, for instance, is there kind of a deadline of like how many sends, how many hooks you've tested? When do you call it quits? I think that's a question we kind of addressed later on, though. So maybe we can circle back to that. I'm guessing, Daniel.
Yeah. I mean, I can answer that now if you'd like. I think like there's no absolute amount of experiments. Like I'm not going to sit here and say you got to do like 50 experiments within email marketing or just generally like direct outreach for it to be a yes or a no. I think you'll be able to understand if this channel is or isn't working within the first probably 5 to 10 different experiments within this. I think it's like one of those things that, again, it like really depends on what you're measuring for and how you're actually going about it. Most of the time at this stage is probably revenue. But at the specific like channel level, it might be demo bookings, or in this instance, it could be just like open rate. So I think there's lots of different experiments within email marketing that you'll measure for. For example, like subject lines. You're not going to book a demo by subject lines. The null hypothesis here is that you want to, or the data that you're going to be like comparing here is open rates from a subject line test perspective. And so as long as you're with the different experiments, as long as you have a baseline understanding on what's good and what's bad, or what's an improvement and what's not, and the tests that you're doing are either one, improving, then in that instance it probably makes sense to keep at it. And I guess the final thing I'll say on that is make sure that you have a North Star in place to really understand whether or not it's moving the needle for you, because there are a lot of granular experiments that you will do within this case or within different channels. And I just feel that a North Star will basically help you just remain in place and on track in terms of having that tunnel vision. Sorry, I can't give you a specific number in terms of those experiments, but usually with the average channel, I would probably give it anywhere between 3 and 6 months. In email marketing perspective, it's probably a bit longer, like 6 months. But yeah.
Cool. Okay. And you think running at least kind of 5 to 10 incremental kind of experiments that should show some incremental improvements at the end of that within over a 3-6 month period, you generally should have a good feel for whether it's going to generate enough.
Yeah, exactly. And I think also like the learnings that you'll get out of it, whether you improve or not, they're still learnings, right? You'll still learn what not to do and what to do. I also think that there'll be a lot of like things that you can learn that you can move to other growth channels as well, like how you're speaking, what your messaging is, and so on and so forth.
Two quick questions. I'm conscious of time. One, Nick's asked a really good question here, which is, if you're early stage and you've got an MVP and you're not necessarily charging you don't have a chargeable product yet, but you've got clear pricing, you're looking for, he's quoted the term design partners, which is quite a common, a lot of this early stage business are working with design partners. Does this process work for finding design partners? Do you think it's still relevant?
Yeah, for sure. 100%. It just, your goal is different, and probably not slightly easier, because I guess like it's obviously still tough, but you're not necessarily asking them to pay. You're just asking for feedback and building alongside them. But yeah, 100%. I guess your North Star in this case isn't necessarily revenue focused, but it's more around an absolute amount of, we want to find 5 design partners. And yeah, so this definitely works just as well when you're a pre-seed business looking for design partners. Usually though, like, you know, when I talk about design partners, most of the time that either comes from referrals or word of mouth or from, you know, your previous job. But that being said, like, it doesn't hurt to invest into maybe 1 or 2 channels outside of that as well.
Yeah, so you're probably leaning on your network and communities to find design partners early.
Not all the time, not always, but I think naturally that's probably the first point of call for finding design partners. But I also do think that in tandem to that, building up a specific channel or 2 channels will definitely help once you've kind of proven concept with those design partners, and you can, you know, go to market.
One thing I have seen, Nick, which might be helpful with finding design partners, is I think that the biggest change will be in the positioning and how you word things and frame things. I've actually seen a really good course which talks about doing your outreach, where you frame your product as, you frame all customers and onboarding as design partners, because it's less salesy. And so actually people do want to help other founders. They do want to get first access to cool tools. So like you can actually play that to your advantage in terms of the framing with the channels that you're experimenting with. So I think that's actually less about taking a different approach to what Daniel's pitched here, and more about taking a different approach to how you frame and pitch the product. The second question here is, how often would you recommend doing this exercise? How much validation expected at different funding stages? And actually, this is a question that I had as well, in terms of like, how many channels are you expected to have working for you as you go through different funding stages? Is it just, you just have to have one big freaking channel and that will take you through all the way to freaking, you know, Series B? Or, you know, this is, I think a good question in terms of, maybe you could talk us through how this changes over time through different funding cycles.
Yeah, so I think like the first step, which I've obviously discussed, which is the initial bullseye. I think this is definitely something that you'll probably do on either a yearly basis. However, at that specific channel level, switching things out could happen between like anywhere between 3 and 6 months. I think the one big thing that changes as you kind of hit different milestones, if you're VC backed, go from pre-seed, seed to Series A, so on and so forth. I think you'll have learned a lot more. You'll have over time gradually understood what as a channel works and what doesn't. Obviously, like, it's still incredibly flexible as you kind of go through pre-seed through to Series A or Series B. But really, there'll be 1 or 2 big drivers of growth that you would have identified, and in that case, naturally over time, you start to hire, you know, your first go-to-market person or a team built around that. And I think naturally, the big thing here is now you're putting it to one side and you're trusting a team. That's one. 2, you would have established within that what's must-have versus nice-to-have for specific channels and skill sets that you need to bring in. So, for example, let's say, you know, direct outreach is a huge one, or you know, TikTok ads or Meta ads or LinkedIn ads, whatever it is. So you really know and understand fundamentally what's a must-have versus nice-to-have, so that you can bring in and hire support for that. And 3, it's a lot less, you know, dependent on your time. And now that you have this team, you can really scale up those channels and really tap into the 1, experimentation velocity, but 2, really investing into the process of growth, feedback loops, iteration, and fully investing into a channel that basically looks to be scalable for your business.
So it'd be healthy to run this exercise once a year and identify quite a few channels to experiment over the course of the year, with most channels being run for 3 to 6 months, to kind of see if they're actually fit. I guess the answer to that question, Alejandro, is also depending on the scale of the channel. some channels just don't scale that fast, or they have a max capacity, like Google Ads. Sometimes there's a max limit on what you can spend in a specific area. And so I guess that also depends on the kind of the saturation of specific channels. Cool. Should we crack through? Should we move on?
Yeah. Cool. So basically now, in some form, you would have basically picked the specific channels that you want to invest into. And this framework is basically used to, within those channels, discuss how you actually go about the different experiments within this. So the first part of this is, let's say you've got like 3 channels now, and you, for one, your first month, you want to fully invest into just like this one specific channel. The first step that you do is basically within that. So for example, in the case of like email marketing, gather ideas. So for half an hour or 45 minutes or however you want to run this process, it's basically just like discussing, again, like if you have a business partner, doing it with them. If you have a person that you can that you've hired, you do it with them, or you can also do this alone. But just outline all the different tests and ideas. No idea is a bad idea, and just jot them down, as many as possible. So that's the first thing that you do. So it could be like subject line test, feedback approach. What's the specific copy, shorter, longer? What's the call to action? Where's the placement of that call to action? There's so many different ideas within different channels, and just jot them down as much as possible. The next part is basically ranking those ideas. So I'm sure that there are tons of different frameworks in terms of prioritizing. Use one that you probably know best, but Pyre or ICE are very similar, and this will basically help you in an absolute way rank these. Typically you do it out of 5 essentially, and from that kind of approach, after you've basically gathered all those ideas, again, you discuss them internally with your business partner, whatever, and from there you'll see what's the top 5-6 channel experiments that we should test. From there,
just to quickly add on that's mainly boiling down, when we've done it in the past, the main things you're ranking them on in when we've done it, Daniel, is how much effort are they to execute, and what is the potential returns. So like subject lines, for instance, test is like, it's not that much effort to test. The rewards are potentially quite a big increase in open rate. So like that's probably quite an easy test to execute versus launching some big new channel, some big thing that you have to do. So that's generally how we've ranked in the past, Daniel, which I guess is part of the Pi and ICE framework.
Yeah, exactly. And there's brass. So I mean, there'll be a section on this within the templates, but I'm sure all of you have different kind of prioritization frameworks. But really, the most important one here is, or the actually 2 components, is importance. So what's the impact that this will have for my business? And then the effort point here. How much effort, resource will this take? The next part is basically, once you have this, is outlining the experiment. So I use a null hypothesis, which is basically saying that this won't work for this experiment. So usually the setup here, and again, there's templates within this. There'll be a description of the test. So what specifically are you doing? What is the null hypothesis saying that this won't work? Take the subject line, for example. Subject lines won't increase our open rates, essentially. And then what are the data points if you have a baseline to say, oh, this actually worked well? So could it be 0.5 historically? And if you get anything over that, we should change everything. And then what's the time frame of this? Typically, the average experiment timeline, usually what I've done is basically work in bi-weekly sprints with weekly calls and meetings in place to actually look at how those experiments are running. However, that being said, take that with a pinch of salt, because a full email marketing campaign with like 800 contacts within that could take a month to 6 weeks to kind of exhaust. And so that was the time frame. So basically take that on a case by case basis, essentially. And yeah, basically outlining those experiments. I think this is a given. Basically, just execute on what you've basically outlined. So yeah, these would be analyzing the results on a weekly basis. If you have teams, or you know, I mean, this is more, the second point here is more around like bulkier growth teams. So typically, sometimes within a growth team, for later stage businesses, you might have a salesperson, a marketing person, and an engineer in that growth team. And so basically just like managing those cross-aligned teams. But yeah, essentially, in short, TLDR is basically launch those campaigns. Finally, after that time frame that you've allocated to it and the data, basically just study that data essentially to see, is this something that's worked for me? Is it not? And here are the points. And consolidate that learning. And then if it's worked, kind of double down on it, iterate if need be. If you've seen some early signs potentially that this could work, but it isn't necessarily the data that you wanted, how can you iterate on that essentially? And so that's in short what the growth framework looks into. So by this point here, essentially what you have is you've established anywhere between 3 and 6 different growth marketing channels that you can invest into. You're now in that middle ring layer, and then this is when you start to have these growth frameworks internally for each of those channels. And within that, you have systemized approach to how you actually go about the different experiments within those channels, and how to actually rank those, how to actually outline those experiments, and what to do in terms of studying that data. And so that's basically the natural next task for you, is like, once you've consolidated those channels, okay, what do I do next in terms of brainstorming those ideas? Well, use the growth framework, and that should help in terms of systemizing and prioritizing those experiments within the channels.
Cool.
Any questions? If not, I can move on to the next.
It's been a couple, but they're kind of more general. So
we'll say, yeah.
One of the questions that we had come in was, do you have a top 3 channels for SaaS startups? So I don't know whether you've seen particular success. I suppose it's kind of like a oxymoron, really, because if it's an obvious top 3 channel, then everyone's using it. It probably gets lots of people moving towards it, and then they become less successful. I guess it's always a moving game, but yeah, is there anything you've seen particularly well?
Yeah, I guess like that's quite vague. What I need to know and understand is, firstly, like, what's your ICP? So your ideal customer profile. How big are the businesses that you're looking at targeting, and in what specific industry? And also what stage you're at. I think if you had those answers, typically at the pre-seed stage, I would probably look at 2 short-term channels and 1 long-term channel. Short-term being probably something that doesn't cost quite a lot. Something like automating your direct outreach on both email and LinkedIn. That would be like one of the first things that I would look into. The second thing, probably dependent on your business, I'd probably look at running some form of ads. So potentially LinkedIn ads if you're if the size of business is will be great enough for you to invest into that, because I think that's leaning more on short term. However, it's building towards long term, and also SEO and GEO. So like, basically content marketing, which can feed foundation across lots of different channels, covers lots of different things within that. So content marketing, you can, the way I think about content marketing is, the reverse triangle is what people call it. But basically, you have a long form piece of content, which can be distilled down into shorter form pieces of content. So you create a blog article, which is great because that will sit on your website from an SEO and GEO perspective. That's great. But then you can kind of break that off into different pieces for short form. So LinkedIn post,
which can then be used in ads and things.
Copy for your ads, so on and so forth. So that's how I would, at your stage, one, like think about the different channels, but two, think about like how to invest into content in terms of macro breaking down into micro.
Cool. Let's crack on.
Yeah, so these next two parts are pretty quick. I might have touched on them in the earlier slides, but I think we're talking about specific experimentation. I think one of the most important parts here is basically having a hypothesis. Now, a hypothesis can be quite broad in the sense that this channel will help me achieve X. And then the hypothesis from an experiment perspective is very granular. So like, as we spoke about in terms of like email marketing and specifically like subject lines is, these specific subject lines will help me increase my click-through rate, for example. So here you're basically clearly defining what are the variables that you're testing against and what are the specific or the expected outcomes that you want that shows what's good, essentially. So make sure that you're formulating those hypotheses. In terms of I guess like designing your experiments, usually there are, there might be some more complicated experiments. So for example, like LinkedIn ads, there is quite a few different things that could go into it that you need a checklist for. And so making sure that you design these experiments in a way that it is efficient for you, but also well structured. And on top of that, making sure that you have the specific variables, metrics to actually measure those outcomes. And yeah, I think that's all on the designing experiments. Implementing experiments, well, basically just like you should have laid out the plan. Again, in the case of LinkedIn ads, create the content. What's the copy? What's the specific date of launch? So there's lots of different granular pieces within each experiment that you might have to spend time on, essentially, which comes back to the prioritization framework of, what's the effort versus reward? How important is this for my business? And so on and so forth. And so that's on the implementation of experiments. And yeah, that's basically it in terms of kind of fleshing out some of those key experiments. And then the last section here before we go into the general questions is basically just the documentation of learnings. So typically what I mentioned right at the start is you kind of go through this entire process, you've invested time, money, resources into this, and you let those insights just like stay on the calls that you've discussed and not actually document those. So what I typically say is before you do retrospectives and before you get on a call and actually discuss these things these are typically like the bi-weekly calls, not the weekly calls, is come ready with those learnings documented, with those pieces of data, with data to kind of back up what those learnings are and those specific insights, and actually write them down in a way that's consumable in layman terms, and basically just have just a place where all that information sits that can be accessed, referred back to. I think I've seen this time and time again is, at that pre-seed stage where things are a bit more scrappy, you kind of just leave it to one side. And as you kind of scale and as you bring in more team members, it's harder to actually pass over that information in a manner because it relies very much on one, you remembering, and two, like your brain. And so I promise you, I've seen this time and time again, just make sure that you are recording those insights, because even as you like switch out team members potentially and people come and go, it's the easiest way to kind of do an efficient handover in a way that someone coming in will understand. That's point one. And then point two is basically sharing this information, across teams. So for example, there might be some valuable knowledge that you've seen from a messaging perspective for your product team, and passing that on to them, will be equally as important to kind of echo that within the product and within the messaging of the product as well. So that's on that, and I think I covered this as well. But these 2 points here, which is retrospective analysis and data driven decision making, is basically consolidating what you found within those experiments, having data to kind of back it up, and making sure that you are, in short, reinforcing those consolidated findings, essentially. Yeah, and I mean, this last point is pretty vague, and I think less applicable to what you're doing right now. But a lot of these learnings can one, be fed into future strategies, and two, it can basically just help across the board in terms of the different teams. It can also help in sales, product, etc. So I think there's a lot of things within those learnings that you can apply, especially when you come back and do potentially another bullseye a year later. You can feed those learnings into your future channels that you invest into. So yeah, I think that is everything. I actually have a growth stack template which essentially covers everything in detail. So if you forget anything, everything is covered in here, around all the different channels. So that's on the bullseye framework. This is on the grows, and then also in practice, like what this actually looks like. I've put basically what the task is at hand for you to do here, and how you go about doing that in practice.
This will be available and linked in the slides that we share afterwards with everyone. So basically, without you having to really think, you can start documenting everything within this. This is experimentation template, and yeah, cool.
And then that's kind of the learnings tab here.
One question that I've got, and guys, if you've got any questions off the back of that, then please obviously chuck them in. We'll go through a couple now. But one question I've got with this is like, how does this like fit in with a team? So do you normally see founders doing this themselves and finding that first channel themselves? Do you normally see like founders in hire, like a generalist first hire who can run these experiments? I can do it. Like, does that mean the founder does test a certain number of channels, and then a generalist hires test a certain number of channels, and together you're able to test more channels together, and then you hire freelance, specific hires. Once you've found a channel, you can hire a specific person who's a specialist in that channel. Yeah, how does this kind of like scale with the team?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think point one is that I always think the best founders who actually spend some time doing the marketing or growth themselves will have a better time bringing in people that they feel, or just like working with them, so that they have a fundamental understanding of what is good, what is bad, what's working, what's not. I also think, like, as you kind of bring in team members, I think that's one of probably the biggest mistakes is you don't necessarily need to bring in a full-time member or a generalist. In fact, you should probably staircase growth. And you can apply this into lots of different components of your business. But specific to growth is you basically staircase into a full-time role, essentially. So that's where kind of like fractional CMOs or fractional growth teams basically help test through this framework. So bringing in specialists first before you bring in a full-time hire is usually the way I would basically go about it, where you bring a specialist for ads, or a specialist in for direct outreach, or a specialist in for whatever channel that you feel could be the best for your business. And then from there, over the next 3 to 6 months, you'll get a fundamental understanding on what's must-have versus nice-to-have, as I've said, in a specific role for your business. And then from there, either hire full-time, hire overseas, whatever it is, and then complement that either with a fractional CMO or a fractional head of growth or whatever it is, and then bring in either a specialist who has a generalist view and understanding of marketing, or just a generalist who can be upskilled by the fractional CMO, essentially.
I think one of the mistakes that I've made in the past is I've brought in an agency to try and like figure out a channel and deliver on that.
Yeah.
And I then left them to kind of figure it out. But what happened is at the end of that, when they hadn't figured that out, I cut them because we hadn't done this framework with them and I hadn't sat with them weekly to document what they'd learned, what they tested. I then like cut them, not knowing, I don't actually know if the channel didn't work or not because I hadn't captured any of those learnings. I hadn't been as part of, hadn't documented any of the experiments they'd run. So I think like from my experience doing this again and working with a specialist, whether it be a freelancer or an agency, is that they have to be brought into documenting. You need to own the experiment, like the information and that knowledge of like what experiments they're running and what the outcomes were. Because if you don't, then you'll end up in a situation where you kind of let them do it, run it all independently, but you have no idea what you've actually did. Were they just bad at what they did, or was there something they didn't test? Or does the channel not work? So that's really, that's from my own experience.
Yeah, I think that's a very common experience. Even I've experienced that when I was working, as a startup, and a reason why I feel that if I had this to actually complement all the agency stuff that I was working with, and as long as you can kind of onboard them, hold them accountable to this, get them embedded into these flows in terms of like how you work and how you think about growth, then you'll be in a great position. One, to just like manage them from an agency perspective, but two, to hold them accountable. But then also three, once you do establish either that this works or this doesn't, at least everything is documented. At least you have some formulated learnings and data to kind of pass on either to a full-time hire or to the next agency or to like whatever it is, basically.
Yeah, cool. Should we wrap up?
Yeah. So basically, if you're interested in a call with me, then feel free. Like, you'll get these slides. You can book in a call, and for 50 minutes, and we can basically discuss anything about growth, anything that you need, and potentially see if there are any synergies there. And then in terms of the Founder Nation, I'll pass over to Andy.
Yeah, guys, this is a masterclass as part of Founder Nation. If you're a founder, we'd love to get you more involved. We run masterclasses like this pretty regularly. We also do some in-person events. We've got over 100 members now. Our center of mass is London, but there's lots of kind of digital and remote stuff that we're doing, and there's a WhatsApp group chat as well to stay in touch. So if you're interested in kind of getting involved in a wider community and being involved in other events, then we'd love to see you there. And you can sign up via the link there. Cool.
Awesome.
Thanks, guys. Really appreciate your time. Thanks for joining, and thanks for all your positive feedback. Speak to you all. Hopefully see you all soon.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye.